He was the giant who drowned the north in blood. It is how the songs begin in taverns and how mothers hush curious children with a warning in their knees. The phrase tastes like iron on the tongue, and the land remembers it long after the voice has gone quiet. Frisia is a place that counts its history by furrows, by the stubborn clay that clings to boots and to bones. Time here is not a straight line, but a wheel that grinds the same grief into new shapes. Seasons pass, invaders come, and the soil keeps names like a ledger, unread but relentless. Once Pier was a man of the earth. The plough was large enough to be mistaken for a spar. It bent under his shoulder and yielded to his rhythm. His hands were calloused in the pattern of lines that matched the fields, a cross of effort, a map of spring and frost. Neighbours spoke of his size with the casual mixture of pride and fear you have toward weather. "He is tall as an oak," they would say. And it was half flattery and half an observation that sometimes decided where barley was stacked or which roofs a ladder might reach. To his children he was bread and stories. To his wife he was the steady hinge between dawn and dark. The land, mud, dike, marsh, was not merely work to Pier, it was kin. Mother Earth, his mother, he called sometimes when a seed sprouted right after a frost, and sometimes when the cattle would not drink. He believed the soil had ears and teeth, that it could taste promises and punish perjury. The first wound came like all betrayals do, abrupt, bright, and criminally intimate. Tax collectors and men from the fortified enclaves, tall men with thin beards and ledger books, men who moved like bureaucracy made flesh, came with writs and threats. They came under a banner that meant other people's rulings, and they came hungry for the easy coin a farming village could not spare. Pillage followed the writ in a short, ugly sequence. A door burst open, a lip of flame, a child's cry swallowed by the roar of smoke. Pier returned to his yard to find his house aflame and his life a heap of ash. His wife and children were taken from him in a single, clean decision of violence that left no time for farewells. Neighbours carried what remained, charred beams, a crucible of grief, into a field that smelled of scorched rye and salt. He stood with his hands raw from pushing wheelbarrows and thought a sentence. Words can become vows when the heart is split open. He said, low and certain, the words that would become the hinge of everything after, "I would rather be dead than a slave." The vow was not rhetorical. It was a blade of intention, sharpened on the grief of a man who had seen the thinness of law when it stood between him and the men who killed his family. Grief made him fierce. Anger made him clever. Grief and anger together made him a leader. Transformation does not always look like the making of weapons. At first it looked like small, practical adjustments. A plank used to pry open a gate became a practice spear. The farm's old halberd, more tool than instrument of war, was straightened, its edge honed. Pier moved among the fields and the taverns, listening for the specific kind of muttered fury that grows when people have little to lose. He learned to shape his words like wedges. Where before he had been blunt and honest, now he cultivated rhetoric that could tip a council or a crowded hall. He spoke of the soil, he spoke of stolen seasons, he spoke of butter, bread, and green cheese, as if it were a liturgy, a test. "Pass those three to me," he would say to a stranger, "and show me which you would give up before the soil." The gesture was almost playful at first, an old man's joke in a place that prized table manners and shared food. But it worked. The phrase became a sign. Those who hesitated had thin stomachs for resistance. Those who slammed their fist onto the table and shouted the three words back were the ones who would march. Pier did not rush into the grandeur of banners. His army began with the kind of recruitment that knows where the stubborn men are. Fishermen with halting hands from pulling nets, peat cutters who had spent whole winters under the cold wind, sons of men who had been humiliated by the levy of an enclave sergeant. He met them where their work left them breathless, and he spoke in the language of loss that needed no translation. "This land keeps what we plant," he would say, spitting a little from the corner of his mouth as if to dismiss the dust on his lips. "It will not forget the blood of its sons." The line was paradoxically comforting. It turned the land into a witness and a jury, and gave the bereaved the righteous role of enforcers of memory. There was training that was more ritual than drill, dragging ropes through the mud to simulate the strain of hauling a siege engine, swinging farm tools until calluses bled under calluses, marching until feet knew the cadence of endurance. Men learned to fight with the implements of their poverty. The plough could be used to wedge a door. An iron ring could become a shackle-breaking pike. Pier taught them to use what they had, and to pretend, convincingly, to occupy the posture of those who had things. The posture mattered. It made the poor feel, for moments at least, like governors of their own fate. Yet alongside this sharpening of bodies came the soft, dangerous work of myth-making. Pier's physique and story were raw material. Some whispered that he fought like a tidal wave. Others said he had a voice that could split a crowd into obedient halves, with a pattern of cadence. He was eager for certain words to stick. In public, he cultivated a persona of controlled fury. In private, he practiced the quieter arts of prophecy, which were less about mysticism and more about timing. He learned when to let grief be visible, an ember under the ash, and when to bury it so he could appear decisive. Not every follower was converted by rhetoric. There were moral strains in the group, men who joined because of necessity rather than conviction. A few sought revenge for slights older than the region's present troubles. Some wanted land, others wanted to mock the writs by renaming themselves rulers of the mud. Pier accepted them all and kept the line between them thin. You could be with us if you would not take, if you would return the spoils to families, if you would pledge by butter, bread and green cheese before a gathering. The ritual was ridiculous enough to be binding and blunt enough to be clear. Politics, however, is a porous thing. Word of the small successes in robberies and the audacity of untrained peasants reached the ears of men who wore chain and silk in their own different ways. The Duke of Guelders, tall, wary, with hands used to pointing rather than sewing, saw potential in making use of those who had little to lose. The Count of Flanders, who had other designs, measured the costs of funding a movement that had neither port nor coin. Noble patrons wanted to turn popular fury into controllable force, or to break it, or to profit from it. To Pier, these negotiations felt like stepping onto ice whose cracks were filled with promises that would be cold to the touch. Money became as necessary as courage. Horses cost coin, ships cost more. The kind of supplies that turned a string of skirmishes into a real threat required gold and bargaining that Pier had never wanted to learn. He cussed when he thought about accounts. He preferred the heat of a fight to the chill of a ledger. Still, he sat in halls smelling of beeswax and old leather, listening as men with titles explained their price. The Duke offered men and a handful of armed retainers for a season, conditional on a certain gain. Put the rebel force to use against a mutual enemy, and the Duke would gain influence when the smoke settled. The Count sent envoys with quiet smiles and paper folded into the shape of courtesies. Alliances were being drawn, not in the air, but on the underside of tables, with servants torturing the handles of casks and hearing nothing. Lady Margaret's agents were the ones who were least patient. She held the county's tax receipts like talismans, came with stern faces, and demanded either dues or peace. She did not speak of justice. She kept her mouth full of practicalities. When she addressed Pier, by messenger and then once in a field where the stench of manure and victory sat together, she spoke of law as if law were a tool that might be turned. "Return the king's dues," she told him through a veil of polite firmness. "Swear fealty or pay what is owed." There is a kind of insult in being asked to pay by the very hands who burned a hearth. Pier spat and named no god. He said he would not be bound by writ to a memory of his children's funeral. The exchange was not a debate so much as the discovery that neither party could truly trust the other. Allies came with strings attached. Money was a rope that could bind more than one limb. Even as some nobles offered small tokens of favor, others whispered about the dangers of being led by a giant without a commission. Pier listened to these words as if they were stones ricocheting off a wooden wall. He learned to lie without pride, misleading men about the size of his intent, promising exits where there were none. The moral compromise was small at the beginning and total at the end. It was during this period of recruitment and bargaining that small raids began, quick, focused, surgical in their violence. A tax cart was overturned under a hedge. A small outlying tower was relieved of its stores in a single night raid. A mercenary captain who had been hired to intimidate was shattered and left to be hauled through mud as a lesson. Such victories fed the myth. News spread along canals and across the coast. In taverns, the clatter of ale mugs measured out the telling of exploits and the appetite for more. But after each victory, there was an ache that no celebration could cure. Survivors came back with haunted eyes, and some men that had once laughed now did not laugh at all. A mother in one village whose son had been taken in a raid kept staring at a tuft of hair she had saved, as if the hair might turn into the living child. Pier saw this. He saw their faces and heard the earth bind their names beneath every step they took. Victory tasted like salt and iron, like the bread that darkened with smoke. There was a private catalogue of losses he kept. At night, Pier would sit by a fire, with no intent to sleep, and allow the remembered sounds to rise, his wife's apron catching flame, his son's last gasp. Once, he swore he heard a chorus of them singing in the reeds outside his shelter, his wife singing the old lullaby she used to hum while burying potatoes, his child humming the rhythm of a plough. "Return," one voice said, "return to the soil." He answered them not in words but in action, more raids, more recruitment, more planning. Yet the private voices did not ease. Instead, they grew like wet rot in some dark corner. The soil had taken kin, and the soil's memory insisted on a reckoning. The movement needed ships. The enclaves were maritime or shielded by water. To reach them without being ground under fortifications required boats and men who knew tides. That is when Fons arrived in the story. At first a rumour, then a man with salt-scraped cheeks and eyes like a gull's. Some said he had been a deserter from a coastal fleet. Others said he had once been a merchant who had traded in stolen wares long enough to grow cool about the law. He brought maps and names, and the kind of confidence men mistake for competence. Pier met him on a quay that smelled of tar and old fish, where ropes screamed in the wind like people begging. Fons' plan was simple, and therefore attractive. Take to the sea in narrow boats at night, strike the enclaves at dawn when men were unready, take their coin and their food, leave the rest to rot. He promised ships. He promised men who could pilot tides like fingers, knowing the curves of strings. Money would come from raids. Ships could be bought by selling what could be sold. It seemed simple. It was not. The first real public appearance that slightly resembled a proclamation came on a wet morning in a town square. The crowd gathered because the word had spread. They came because hunger makes hope cheap and because anger is less lonely when shared. Pier stood on a raised cart that had once carried hay and now served as a rostrum. He smelled of smoke and damp wool. Behind him, banners made by women with quick hands and slower grief flapped like questions. He spoke then in a voice that had been honed, not by practice alone, but by the brutal calibration of loss. "You know these fields," he said, and the crowd answered with murmurs. "You know how clay bites the soles of your boots, how the tide takes and gives. You have been taxed until the little things are gone, butter, bread, and green cheese. Who among you will be owned? Who among you will bow when your hearth is taken?" The three words were a litmus. They rose from the crowd like a tide. Men slammed fists. Women cried a long, small sound. The chant took shape. Butter, bread, green cheese. It was musical and ugly and binding all at once. He offered them then not a promise of heaven, but a plan that smelled of iron and risk. "We will take what is ours back," he said. "We will take ships. We will take coin where coin is hoarded. We will drown the command of those who think they can write our life into a bill." The line that named drowning the North in blood was not meant to be literal at first in his mind. It was hyperbole, an old man's dramatic flourish that sounds better in the telling than the doing. Yet the men hearing it had their own imaginations, and they painted it with a hunger that made the phrase immediate and cold. The crowd's response was not unanimous. Such things never are. There were hands raised to ask for counsel, for a pause, for someone with law to broker peace. There were quiet men who muttered a prayer. But the majority wanted to move, and movement makes for inertia. When a plan begins, the tiniest action becomes a pivot. A cart moved from one side of a lane can change a life. It is here, after the rally, that the first mid-course decision is made. They would demand ships, but make an immediate strike on a minor storehouse belonging to an enclave, less for its riches than for its symbolism. The story of the first successful theft spreads faster than the shame of its moral cost. An old man named Henaric, who had once been a baker, swung a plank and cracked a skull. A fisherwoman named Pier waded into a small skirmish waist-deep in a canal and came out carrying a pouch of coins clenched between her teeth. The violence was cramped and close. It did not look like legend yet, it looked like life. If you have followed this long, and if this voice has found a place in you, then stay. There are other legends like this, other giants, other betrayals, other times when the earth remembers its sons. If you want more deep dives into medieval legends like this, subscribe and ring the bell. There are more stories waiting in the mud, more songs to be heard between the dikes. That night Pier did not sleep. He walked among men who had been polished by their own courage and were becoming slick with blood. He watched them strip leather and mend a rope and lick a wound, and then stand near the fire as if none of the rest mattered. He spoke in low tones to a few. "Keep to the rules," he told one young man. "We take only what secures a family's year, no more. But the rules are things men invent in safe moments. When food becomes a knife in your throat, rules are either kept or reinterpreted." Rumors traveled as fast as coins in those days. The Duke, in his cautious way, offered a small contingent to raid a small garrison that had been a thorn in his side. He asked, in exchange, for a future claim on certain lands, a draft written in noble hands that might one day be enforced by soldiers. Pier accepted, not because he wanted to trade freedom for a parchment, but because he understood power. Power needs witnesses who can enforce what a man says. He understood, too, that every pact with a lord is a bargain with gravity. The farther one pushes a stone up the hill, the more likely it is to slip back with a crash. The first season ended with a few successes and a few decisions that would look in time like cracks in armor. Men who had been disciples of simplicity found themselves drinking wine with merchants who smelled of the sea and of other people's fortunes. There were divided loyalties. A man named Fons, who had been praised for his seamanship, began to insist upon terms that made others nervous. He wanted a share larger than the rest, and a right to pick targets. Pier felt the shape of danger then, the kind that is sewn into companionship with those who both help and take. Pier's nights became populated not by the lullabies of his lost family, but by a relentless procession of accusations. Faces of men he had slain or let be slain, a woman's hand reaching from the soil to touch his shoulder, a child's call without end. He would wake in the dark and taste blood on his tongue, though no wound opened. Once he stumbled outside and spoke aloud to the empty sky. "Is this what you demanded, Mother? Is this what the land asks of me?" The wind answered with reeds and a gull crying. In his inner ear he had the sense that the soil was listening and that it was not indifferent. The movement had become a thing that needed more than outrage. It needed craft. The first lessons in craft were ugly. The spoils had to be distributed, but distribution czarred power. Some men grew fat with opportunity, others went hungry. Men who had initially sought justice found the taste of plunder sweet, like the best of honey hidden at the base of bitter root. Pier watched the corruption as if from a distance, and realized, irritated and ashamed, that he too had been hardened by the necessity of leadership into someone who could make a barter and sleep after. There were betrayals that had nothing dramatic about them. A captain from a nearby village who had sworn himself to the cause took a bag of coin and vanished into the marshes. He left a note that said only, "For my family." Pier understood the gesture and cursed it at the same time. These small treasons are often where revolutions die, not in the clashing of arms, but in the quiet artery clogging of trust. And yet, despite the small collapses, the movement coalesced. Women sewed flags with crude emblems of reeds and waves. Men sharpened iron until the sparks looked like stars scattered across a dark roof. Children stood at the edge of the camps and watched the adults who were changing history. They would later sing of those nights, compressing the truth into rhyme and rhythm, sometimes hagiography, sometimes scorn, often both. When winter and sea mists came, Pier sat in a room thick with smoke and listened as the political partners he had, grudgingly by necessity, bargained in the dry, clever language of men who never saw furrows, but would profit from them anyway. The Duke sent a horseman with wine and a ledger. Lady Margaret's envoy left a sealed note. Each present was, in its own way, an attempt to fold the popular fury into the more manageable shape of noble advantage. Pier allowed them into his circle enough to get ships and men, but not enough to be eaten by their court. He had learned the distinction between being used and being brokered. The marsh was learning the sound of men who had decided to stay awake, and beyond the marsh, the enclaves watched. They began to build palisades, to shift watchposts to face the water, to consult captains who had formerly called themselves neutral. These were signs that small rebellions had become inconvenient to those in power. Once inconvenience becomes expensive, men with titles and coin begin to move with urgency. At the edge of such movement, there is always a moment when the trajectory can tip either toward liberation, understood as communal emancipation, or toward a darker thing, a revenge that feeds on itself until nothing remains but a long, shuddering bitterness. Pier felt the shift like a bruise that grows and spreads. He moved through that winter with eyes that did not close easily, with a sensation of something that wanted to be satisfied and could never be. He kept his vow, but the vow was loaded now, weighted by the deeds it had justified. A council met in the cold. They argued in hushed voices with the fervor of men who know how precarious a seasonal plan is when ships and tides must be aligned. Fons insisted on more audacious strikes. Others asked for measured regional pressure. The Duke wanted a decisive blow that would force the enclaves to reconsider their levies. The Count suggested sabotage and slow attrition. Pier listened, weighing each option by the metric that had become his only arithmetic. Will the family of a man who has been taken back get bread for a year? Will a tenant be able to till his field next season? He found in that ledger both righteousness and a kind of arithmetic that refused to be neat. When the decision was made to strike by sea, to take the enclaves at dawn with narrow boats and stealth, it felt like a confirmation. Boats were acquired by an arrangement with an obscure captain who had once been in debt to Fons. Men were taught to move like shadows on the water, to make no sound but the slow sucking of oars, to think of tides as allies. Supplies were packed in such a way that distribution would make sense after plunder. The plan was elegant for the mind and monstrous for the consequences. That is how all great undertakings feel in their infancy, elegant in design, monstrous in result. Pier walked along the quay as the men loaded provisions. He watched the shadows of ships lean into the river like beasts listening. He heard the melody of the chant from the camp, butter, bread, green cheese, and felt both the beauty and the danger of a people that had learned to sing themselves into war. He thought of his wife and children, of the hearth that had been reduced to ash, and felt something familiar press at his ribs, the conviction that a wound wants to be avenged, that the earth wants its own to be avenged. He also felt a foreign thing, the faint, sour taste of doubt. A single image returned to him then, stubborn and obscene. The field after battle, where mud is interlaced with blood and the furrows remember each drop. He had told men that the land remembers. He had meant it as an arm to hold a people. Now the memory of the land seemed less like a comfort and more like a ledger that keeps a ruthless account. He wondered what would be written in the soil come spring. Night deepened. Men moved toward the boats with the practiced quiet of those who know they are about to cross a line. Fons came last, his face drawn tight, eyes brighter than they had been in the winter. He clasped Pier's shoulder as if to promise loyalty and whispered something strange, an assurance that everything would be worth the risk. Pier watched him and considered the fact that every leader must share risk with men whose moral chorus is not tuned to the same pitch. If the sea is a mirror, thought Pier, then perhaps it is also a place that can swallow and reflect. The boats rocked gently, as if waiting to answer a summons. The men lowered into them, one by one, each one a small universe of grief and hunger. Pier stepped into the last boat as the river accepted their weight. He felt the wood flex. He looked back once at the lights of the camp, at the silhouette of the people who had trusted him. He felt the shape of his vow with a clarity that was almost like a physical thing pressing from his chest. The oars bit into the black water. The town slunk away behind them. In the hush, as sound narrowed to the sound of water and breath, Pier allowed a private, terrible thought to rise, clear as a bell. What if the land's remembering becomes a sentence we cannot undo? He pushed the thought away and concentrated on the rhythm of oars. Men around him breathed in the same cadence. Somewhere ahead, the enclave slept, its watchmen careless, because they had always been careless. The night held its breath. The boat drew nearer, and the men who had been farmers and fishers became, in that shifting hour, instruments of an unfolding thing whose outcome none could fully calculate. This was the moment the campaign left the smallness of a village and stepped into the scale of legend. Legends begin, not with clarity, but with devotion and a cruelty that mistakes itself for necessity. Pier looked at his hands, raw from the oars, and tried to listen to the earth beneath his memory. He wanted still to be a son of the soil, not its butcher. He wanted justice, not an empire of wounds. The quay ahead appeared, lit by a single lantern. Shapes moved across the wall above, figures groping for their boots, a dog barking and then quieting. The men tightened their grips. The water closed. For a moment the world was compressed into the small, precise task of getting there. When on the shore, the first cry cut the air, urgent and brief. The boat's prow drove into the reeds. The men spilled out, careful and fast. What followed was the kind of thing that will be told in two ways, with the pride of those who call survivors and with the horror of those who count the dead. They struck. They took what they could. They fled before the full force of the garrison could be mustered. They returned to the marsh with sacks of coin, iron, and a few prisoners bound and bruised. There were shouts of triumph in the camp, and then there was a silence that cut deeper than the shout, a child's lament rising from a tent where a man's family had been found in the course of the raid. a mother clutching for a son who had been compressed by panic and crushed. The men gave coin to the mothers and listened blankly to the sound of grief, tradesmen in the currency of sorrow. Pier stood in the thick afterlight and felt both the fast elation and the slow rot. The operation had worked. The ships had proved useful. Fons had been skillful. There had been no grand disaster. But victory tasted complicated. The men who had seen brutality begin to accept it as part of the work. Their hands no longer recoiled from it, as if it were something foreign. The distribution of spoils created an argument that a ledger could not fix. A sub-leader, hungry and newly confident, argued over a pouch of coins and spat in a man's face. One of the prisoners, a clerk who had been used to counting fields in ledgers, was found strangled at the edge of the camp the next morning. Some said it was an accident, others said it was justice. Pier said only with a weary, raw voice, "We do not become them." But the words slid in mud. Men kept their hands closer to perfume and coin. The bargains with nobles tightened like nooses. The Duke demanded a share, the Count wanted recognition, Lady Margaret demanded restitution, and Fons wanted a larger payment for his struggle. Pier realized then that the movement had become a morsel too tempting to noble hands and too necessary to those who hungered. He recognized in the way the men argued at the distribution circle the beginning of a story he had feared, that the movement would be absorbed into the same system it had meant to challenge. He cursed himself quietly for letting the rage make him a negotiator with aristocrats. He cursed himself for needing their ships. At dawn, after the mention of the murdered clerk on the camp floor, Pier walked alone into the field that had been his before the fire. He knelt and pushed his fingers into the clay. The soil was damp and smelled of peat and old things, of rot and life in the same breath. He tried to hear beneath the wind for whatever it was the land kept. He wanted, absurdly, that the dirt should excuse him, or at least acknowledge him. Instead, it held him like a patient thing that will catalogue everything, naming it later. "He remembers what we do," he said aloud to no one. "If we take more than necessary, he will remember that too." An old woman who had followed them from the beginning, who kept a pouch of herbs and an eye for bad omens, came close. She had seen the way his face had changed in the last months. "The land does not make the choice for us," she said. "It keeps records. We are the scribes." Pier wanted to say something brave. He wanted to promise a future in which the fields would be tilled by hands that did not tremble at memory. But he found himself whispering instead the worrying thing men whisper when they are afraid. "I would rather be dead than a slave." The vow still had the power to steady his voice. But now it also had weight. It could be used or misused. He understood that the vow, like a blade, could cut both throat and rope. As winter loosened its grip and the first hard buds of spring dared to show, their small victories added up. The name Grutte Pier, Great Pier, began to travel beyond the marsh and the quay. Some said it was his size. Others said it was the size of his ambition. Songs took the cruelty and the courage and turned them into rhythms young men could march to. Old men who had never left the village told their grandchildren of the man who would drown the north in blood, and meant it as a warning and a lament both. That was the birth of a legend, the compression of nuance into an echo that men could carry without its full burden. At length there came the first true negotiation with the Duke and the Count together, a meeting that smelled of waxed tables and liveried men. They came not to praise but to propose arrangements that would bind both parties. They offered coin in exchange for control over certain ports and privileges to some men who would be granted titles in name perhaps, but useful in the world that measured power by what could be signed. The offer was practical and dangerous. It had the quality of coal that looks black but bears flame. Pier listened. He had promised himself that he would not be anything that resembled a lord. He thought of his wife's hands folding cloth and of his children's small feet running over the threshing floor, and he imagined those feet grown old enough to receive a title and kneel for it. He saw the line that began with necessity and widened into empire. He understood that the choice was no longer merely tactical, it was ethical. He would have to decide whether the project would end in the boot of another overlord or in some sort of fragile freedom. That decision hung in the air like an unread letter. Men began to discuss the vocabulary of rulership in low voices. They began to leave the communal meals to dine with merchants in rooms that smelled of cardamom, though cardamom had nothing to do with Frisia, save the fact that coin can buy spice. The movement found itself tempted by the tools of its enemy and tempted to use them in a new way. Pier walked away from the hall and into a sky that was muttering rain. He thought of the many small compromises and of the ledger the land kept. He thought of the taste of victory and the taste of blood, and how often the two blend until you cannot tell which you are savoring. He felt, with a clarity that was almost a cruelty, that the movement had reached a seam. On one side of the seam lay a kind of freedom that would have been hard and humble and clean. On the other lay a power that could be used to secure farms and to claim titles and to become something else entirely. He heard a child's voice in the distance, singing a line he did not know, as if the world were trying to remind him that songs live longer than men. He put his hand to the soil again and felt it cold and patient. In the days that followed, plans were drawn for more daring raids. Fons pushed for a wide sweep across the northern coast, a string of blows that would both gut the enclaves and secure maritime control. The Duke pressed for a season of cautious raids that would leave room for negotiation. Lady Margaret insisted on restitution first, then cooperation. Men who had been peasant soldiers argued with men who had been merchants and with men who had once been minor officers. The landscape of allegiance shifted like wind-blown salt. Pier began to sleep less. His dreams were no longer of the plough, but of quick flashes. A line of men marching in the dark, a child's face under a heap of straw, a ledger with a name in it that felt like accusation. The land was patient, he thought. It had all the time in the world to keep what had been done. Men were brief. History was long. The tide had turned in the sense that motion required constant motion. They would need to take more or die quietly beneath the weight of taxes. Yet each strike created enemies and deepened the moral stains on the movement. Pier felt both the righteous engineer of resistance and the uneasy foreman of an enterprise that could consume its makers. He saw the outline of the future, and it was not clean. At dusk, as they loaded a convoy bound for a small port that Fons insisted could be taken at dawn, Pier stood at the quay again and watched the water blacken with a storm. He felt in his chest something like a bell tolling. The name Grutte Pier was growing, and with it the sense that history would one day have to answer whether he had been a liberator or something grimmer. He thought of his vow and of the soil. He thought of the taste of blood and the taste of bread. He did not know the answer. Only the land, perhaps, would keep it. He stepped into the boat, and the oars began to move. The men bent their shoulders and woke the sea. The horizon opened like a mouth. The campaign pushed forward, and with it the slow shaping of legend and lament. The campaign pushed forward, and with it the slow shaping of legend and lament. Spring and then summer bled into one another, and the men learned the geometry of violence, where a dike could be forced, which gate creaked at dawn, which captain rode too slow to answer. Fons pushed for the grand sweep, an idea that sounded like a map come to life. Take the string of harbours along the coast, choke the enclave's supply lines, hold the sea so merchants and collectors could no longer move freely. It was bold, it was tempting. It was also a threshold. The preparations were enormous in a way that the land could sense. Boats were gathered under false names. Tarred ropes glimmered like black veins. Men who had once mended nets now learned to splice sails. Merchants in distant ports who had once turned a blind eye to contraband were offered a cut. The Duke, whose appetite for influence had been whetted by earlier successes, supplied a band of professional men-at-arms and a promise, so often the most dangerous of commodities, that if Pier could take the right port, the Duke's influence would bind the enclave's trade to new hands. Lady Margaret wrote no letters of blessing. She wrote demands and warnings and left them like a chill on the negotiating table. The Count of Flanders watched and weighed, giving curt counsel and measuring his coins where they could be seen. The night of the great operation was so still that the reeds along the river edge seemed to hold their breath. Perhaps history makes itself out of those held breaths, small acts arranged into a pattern that becomes undeniable. Men boarded the narrow boats like a swarm pouring from a hive. Oars dipped and rose. The dark water took their shapes and hid them. Pier climbed in last, feeling the cool give of the wood beneath him, feeling the press of his vow as if it were a garment fit too tight. He had rehearsed plans until the lines in his hands were as familiar as field furrows. He had thought of every contingency except the one that comes from inside a man, the way hunger and triumph loosen tongues and tighten a man's belief in his own rightness until he mistakes appetite for justice. They landed just before dawn. A hush, then movement, men slipping through hedgerows, men lifting a gate with hands practiced in lifting hay, men whose faces were a litany of the hard work of survival. Their first strikes were fast and precise. Watchtowers taken, warehouses forced, small squads of militia overwhelmed in places where surprise and will could replace training and steel. They moved like thieves who had learned the craft well. For a time, the operation was everything Pier had hoped. Swift, efficient, decisive. They took what they needed and vanished before the garrison could gather its strength. Then, like a stone roused in the belly of a marsh, something shifted. A minor patrol blundered into a camp, and panic did what panic often does. It created edges for cruelty to step through. A man, cornered and shouting, said a name that set another man remembering a wrong older than the river. The small law they had tried to keep, that they would take only enough to keep families fed, blew away in a wind of fear. Men who had watched their children die in flames now watched other men in the same light and felt an answer inside their fists. Orders were given to spare those who were innocent. Orders are soft things in the clamour of slaughter. A clerk was lashed to a post. A sergeant was dragged into the mud and broken. The shore tasted like iron and salt in a way that no one could pretend was metaphor. When at last the attack ran its course, the camp returned to the boats heavy with plunder and heavy with the mute weight of what had been done. The men sang no victory songs that night. Some wept quietly into sleeves that were meant to wipe dirt, not tears. Pier felt the ledger of his soul tilt. He told himself he had seen worse in the burning of his house than any of this. He repeated the vow as if repetition could harden intention into moral armor. Still, in the quiet that followed, there was an image that refused to leave him, a child pressed against the ribs of a dead man whose face had been pale with surprise at being found. The child's hands clutched a bit of bread, half-chewed, like a remnant of the ordinary world. The news of the raids travelled quickly, faster than the men who had carried the sacks and the coins. In the enclaves the alarm bells rang, and guards who had once been complacent found themselves suddenly vigilant. Merchants locked storerooms. Palisades were rebuilt with haste. The Duke sent additional men, not out of generosity, but because he had to show that he could still influence events at sea as well as on land. Lady Margaret's letters arrived instructive and colder than paper ought to be. The Count shifted his ships to patrol certain channels and sent men to probe the loyalty of disputed towns. For Pier, the greatest danger was not the open reprisal, though reprisal came, but the way his own men were being reshaped by repeated violence. There is no return to innocence once a hand has learned the taste of causing fear. Some men came back with eyes that had settled into a look that was not quite alive. Some laughed like madmen at the memory of a thrown torch. Others kept their hands so ready to strike that they startled at a dropped pan. Pier watched these changes as an observer of his own making, and he felt a hollow grow where his certainty had been. Fons grew bolder. With each successful landing, he felt his own star swell. He began to demand compensation that matched his risk, then compensation that matched his ambition. He began to pick targets that made sense tactically, but tasted like vengeance. A manor whose lord had once boasted at a market. A storehouse whose owner had signed a writ of eviction. Pier began to see in Fons the reflection of what zeal can become when it is nourished by prize and fortune. He spoke to Fons in private and tried to remind him of their rules. We take to feed a year, not a grudge. But Fons would look at him with the sort of impatience that men reserve for slow-growing crops. Histories, Fons said one night, are not written by men who hesitate. Words can be as binding as oath. They can also be a lubricant for ambition. The Duke tightened his grip. The Count offered to recognize certain leaders with titles that meant little to the fields, but much in coin and law. Small men who had followed Pier for bread and for vengeance began to see futures they had never imagined. A patch of land that could be called theirs by some charter, a seat at a table that once had not bothered to glance at them. The trade-off was obvious and corrosive. Men who took the titles became slowly less like the men who had tilling hands, and more like the men whose hands signed away others' claims. The movement's egalitarian pulse thinned. In the wake of the biggest of the summer raids, when a cluster of ports along the coast had been attacked in quick sequence, and the sea itself seemed for a time to answer them, something larger than men shifted. Bodies were found on beaches and in guttered wharfs. The water curled against the land as if to hold back a stain. The phrase that would come to be quoted in taverns, "He drowned the north in blood," was hushed at first in the councils and then spoken aloud in grim, half-jesting admiration at nights when coin was counted and the dead were not. It was that image, sea and land indistinguishable, salt and iron mixed, that gave the rumour its monstrous currency. Men who had been small found that others were speaking their names with reverence. Songs shortened the horror into a hook, a line easy to sing while hands were busy. There followed a day of reckoning. Word reached them that a convoy from a distant lord had been intercepted while trying to move goods for the holdings that now fell under the Duke's tentative authority. The convoy had been set alight after a parley had broken down. Men had been found with their throats slit, and the sea near the landing stained dark with a slow spreading shadow. In the aftermath, voices disagreed about who had given the orders. Some said it had been a local leader in a frenzy. Others said it had come from men who had been paid handsomely and had been told to show no mercy. Pier refused to believe the worst, that his men were capable of what they were being accused of. Nevertheless, he did not deny that the evidence suggested a scale of atrocity that could not be dressed as necessary. He ordered inquiries, though such things are difficult when the same hands that fight must also judge their own. The inquiry found little comfort. A name was offered, someone from a band not fully under Pier's command. He was found, and he was executed with the quiet procedural cruelty of a makeshift court. It did not undo what had been done. Mothers whose sons had been taken in those border towns cursed in languages that had nothing to do with excuse. Lady Margaret used the occasion as a justification to tighten her levies. The Duke used it to demand greater obedience. The Count of Flanders kept his distance and his ships. Pier felt the ground close in. He had once thought that victory would be the remedy to grief, that the taking back of coin and grain and the humiliation of collectors would soothe the burning hole in his chest where his family had been. But victory brought new grievances, and each grievance constructed itself from the sobbing husk of someone else's loss. The vow he had made, live free or die, was starting to look like a blade whose edge caught friend and foe alike. At night, he walked the lines of his camp, touching the crates, listening to men sleep in the way someone listens for a pulse. He had become, by force of circumstance, a father to a strange family, men who followed him because of speech, because of bread, because of grief. He tried to give them guidance, but words had lost their weight. Once he sent men back to a small town, nearly taken by panic, to return what had been stolen from a widow. They returned with half the supplies and a story about how a group of ruffians had taken the rest. The thought that justice could be enforced and kept clean felt like a child's faith, sincere but fragile. There came a moment, a line drawn under a chapter, when everything he had built seemed to be balanced on the edge of an oar. A coalition of enrolled men and noble contingents agreed on a thunderous attack intended to break any remaining anchor the enclaves had on maritime trade. It was the sort of plan that sounds perfect on paper and monstrous in flesh. The Duke sent a small fleet. The Count supplied experienced sailors. Pier supplied the men who would go in close and take the harbours at the mouth of the river. Fons advised a particular landing, insisting that surprise and numbers would make the difference. They sailed at dusk with a sky that had the pale colour of unripe fruit. The attack burst like a wound. Fortifications collapsed under weight and cunning. Men who had once been bakers lifted iron and met militias face to face. For a time it seemed that the plan would be flawless. Then a misread of tide, and a late messenger turned orderly progress into chaos. A line of ships found itself trapped by the wind and a narrow channel. The garrison sallied, and a pitched battle bloomed on the shore. It was here, on a long, terrible morning of smoke and shouts, that the phrase of tavern songs became literalized in the bloodied sensibility of the land. Men fought with such passion that they forgot their own faces. The marsh behind the line took bodies into its black mouth, and the tide pulled some under, as if the sea itself had decided to swallow the conflict whole. The water near the quays churned with a sheen that no oil could make, and the air filled with the metallic smell of loss. Pier, in the thick of it, felt himself both smaller and larger than before. He had the ability to thrust men into danger. He also understood, with a new clarity, how much of a person remained after being ordered to push. Fons fought like a man possessed. He killed with the efficiency of someone who had made a bargain with fate. He seized a storeroom and held it as if it were sanctified. But somewhere in the day, as orders blurred into the noise of combat, Fons made a decision that would mark him and the entire campaign. He allowed a group of men under his command to take and slaughter prisoners who would have been valuable ransoms. He justified it with logic that sounded like necessity. The men were dangerous if released. The men had been cruel. It was the sort of argument that can be made to justify almost anything once a leader accepts the premise that certain lives are less life than others. Pier learned of it in a way that left him stunned. A courier brought the report with ink still damp, and men at camp showed him the torn clothing and the pockets emptied of anything useful. Pier's orders had been for restraint in exchange for influence. Fons's actions had been raw and punitive. Pier confronted him, and their exchange was not the kind of duel found in stories, but something quieter and more terrible. "We are not what they were," Pier said, voice low and blunt, the sun making his shadow long along the grass. "We do not become them." Fons's reply was a kind of laugh, the sound of a man whose world had reordered itself around deeds committed. "Are you still teaching sermons while men bleed for your cause?" he said. "Words will not feed a widow. Steel will. There is a moment in every rebellion when the necessity argument becomes a habit. Once you have crossed some lines in the name of necessity, the return is impossible." Pier felt a sickness in his mouth like old iron. He thought of his wife and of the ash, and remembered how, in the first days, the vow had felt like a clean thing. He had wanted freedom. Now he tasted dominion. The battle's result was Pyrrhic. The ports were taken, but at a cost that could not be accounted for simply in coin. Men who returned bore wounds and nightmares. Villages that had once been neutral now had lists of exact grievances. The Duke tried to write the day as a triumph that his signet could claim. Lady Margaret laboured to bind local authorities in new, restrictive orders. The Count sought to distance himself from the worst of the violence and to profit where he could. For Pier, there was no parade. There was a hollow roar of singing men who thought themselves winners, and the quiet cries of those who had watched a life dismantled for fewer gains than anyone had promised. Stories began to shift. Where once men told of the man who refused to be owned, songs mutated to celebrate a man who made others afraid. The phrase, "He drowned the North in blood," began to be invoked both as bragging and as a curse. Some scholars later would argue about intent and scale. The chroniclers at the time simply wrote of what their eyes saw, a region reshaped by violence and a leader who had stood at the center of it, massive and troubled. In the camp after the great battle, Pier began to see faces where there had been empty fields. His wife's hands haunted him. Hands that had once smoothed bread and folded clothing now seemed to touch the edges of his mind. Children he had never known raised their voices in songs that repeated his name with both reverence and fear. At night he would sometimes hear, under the crackle of fires, the old lullaby his wife had sung, and he would grip the edge of his pallet as if to hold the world together. The earth, he believed, kept accounts. It had been patient and slow to speak. It was not patient as silence. One clear morning he walked to a furrow he'd left unplanted and sank to his knees. He dug, with fingers used to oars and to the occasional sword, and let the soil fall through his hands. It clung in the familiar way and smelled of seed and last night's rain. He pressed his face near the ground and listened, as men sometimes do when they hope for absolution. He thought he heard a voice. Not a voice that spoke in words, but one that suggested a ledger. Names counted, names added. He felt an unfamiliar kind of shame. The vow had been pure once, but men had a way of making purity into a tool, and tools can be wielded by anyone. After the biggest of the confrontations, the coalition that had followed him began to splinter under the strain of what they had become. Petty quarrels at distribution circles became violent. The men who had once roared, "Butter, bread, green cheese," now muttered among themselves about possessions and about who would be granted land under the new order. The Duke wanted ports, the Count wanted trade privileges, Fons wanted command, Pier wanted an answer he could no longer find. How to secure justice without bending the movement into something indistinguishable from its enemies. Betrayals multiplied in small ways that cut deeper than open betrayal. A leader took a pouch of coin and fled. A trusted lieutenant sold information to a noble for a promise of safety for his family. The roving men who had made up the force began to picture futures that included mansions and titles, not the humble stead of a man who had once tilled land. Where once there had been shared bread by a common hearth, now there were private tables with doors shut. The revolution's social fabric thinned. Pier felt the fracture in a way that required no one to point it out. He watched friends arguing for shares, watched wives of notable men being given tokens, watched children of his soldiers taught by a tutor. The elasticity that had allowed their cause to grow now contracted around the very ideals that had inspired it. He could see himself framed in the future as either a liberator or as a tyrant. He could see, with equal clarity, how the telling would depend on who wrote the songs. At the edge of the marshes, the land was doing the work that land does. It remembered. Footprints were filled in by wind. Blood sunk into peat and changed its smell. In the late light, Pier often walked alone to the places that felt sacred. The ditch where a child's laughter once shattered silence, the half-burned boundary of his old home, and he found himself speaking aloud in the way men do when they are trying to make an account. "I did this to keep us," he said sometimes into reeds. "I did this so our children do not bow." The soil answered only with the rustle of grass. As winter approached again, so did a new kind of fatigue. Men are not built to be at war indefinitely. The body needs harvests, and the mind needs stories that do not end in the sound of death. The leaders argued about whether to press on for another season. The Duke wanted to hold the ports they had taken, and to use them to negotiate power with neighbouring lords. Fons wanted to press further, to make the name of Grutte Pier into something that would last like a carved stone. Pier, who had once believed in the righteousness of action, found himself wishing for something smaller and cleaner, a handful of soil tilled by hands that did not tremble when they touched seed. Then came the betrayal that would for some mark the end and for others the beginning. Accounts differ, and that is perhaps as much a part of legend as the facts. Some say that in the bitumen-coloured hour before dawn, a band of mercenaries paid by a distant lord slipped into camp and set fires to the stores. Others say that a group within the movement paid to defect rose and struck from behind. A particularly persuasive rumour told that Fons, always hungry for gain, had struck a bargain with a lord who wished to see the movement broken before it could become a rival. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. Flames and blood in a place that had once been a refuge. Men fleeing as their own stores burned, the smell of roast grain and molten iron thick in the air. Pier fought that night like a man with nothing left to lose and everything to answer for. He went among his men, taking heads and handing out orders. He found Fons during the chaos, not in command but trying, some said, to shepherd women and children to boats. Their meeting was brief and brutal. "You gave us the shape of our ruin," Pier said, voice hoarse. "How do I bury the promise with the bones you've laid before me?" Fons said nothing that resembled contrition. "We were offered a safe future," he said. "I thought of my own blood. You would have had us die in a field of memory." Pier raised a hand that had once driven a plough and struck Fons across the face. It was a blow that was meant to cleave two worlds, the world of necessity and the world of greed. Fons fell, and where he fell, the narrative shifted slightly. Some men guarded him, others would not. The band of mercenaries, or the defectors, moved through and then away, taking with them certain spoils and certain rumours. The movement survived the night, but the movement had been wounded in a place that would not heal cleanly. What followed was a slow contraction of the power Pier had accumulated. The Duke and the Count, disgusted by the rout and the moral cost, distanced themselves where they could. Titles that had been promised were delayed or denied. The men who had joined for the idea of bread and of justice now found themselves bargaining to keep what they'd taken. The people of the reclaimed towns and the surrounding villages began to demand restitution and reconciling acts. Some things were returned, many were not. Pier, meanwhile, felt the axis of his life tilt toward a solitude that was both chosen and imposed. He could not undo what had been done. He could not bring back the burned hearth or the face of a child. He could only make choices about the remainder. He stopped attending certain councils, giving others deference he had not previously allowed. He walked more often with his hands in his pockets, feeling the small weight of the soil on his fingertips when he stopped to rest. In the quieter months that followed, tales multiplied. Some painted him as the man who had given Frisia a name in the mouths of lords, others as the butcher who had stained its furrows. Children whispered the liturgy of butter, bread, and green cheese in a dozen accents, using the phrase as both pledge and prayer. Old women muttered songs that cut both ways, praise and warning braided together. The land did what it does. It kept the names, and it sent up sprouts over graves. Pier's conscience was a landscape of its own. He sometimes woke gasping from dreams where the earth opened and revealed a ledger of bodies. Sometimes he would sit at a shore and look at the water, seeing in its surface not just reflection, but record. He had expected perhaps a simple end, a last stand, a neat closing image where his vow would be fulfilled in full, and then the world would move on. Instead, the end came with a slowness that required a different kind of courage, facing the consequences without the theatre of battle. Accounts of his final days differ like stray reeds in a river. Some say he died striking at a garrison that had remained loyal to an old order, dying in a tangle of ropes and mud, fingers still clenched as if holding a plough. Others say he survived and retreated to a small plot of land, where he lived out his remaining years, tending the soil and speaking rarely, a hulking figure with a face patterned by loss. There are even claims, less plausible but persistent, that he took to a boat and left the marsh forever, a giant walking into the fog until he was only a silhouette in the songs. Perhaps the truest thing is the uncertainty itself. Legends are grown in the spaces between facts, and they are nourished by the things people wish to remember and the things they hope to forget. The land, however, remained the most impartial chronicler. The fields bore the scars of battle and the quiet of return. Where plough had not met the soil for seasons, it resumed. Where blood had soaked deeply, grass grew in shades that betrayed the earth's memory more than any song could. What is certain is this: Pier's name did not die with him. If he was called great in the mouths of those who revered power, he was called something else in the mouths of those who had seen the cost. Mothers carried admonitions in lullabies. Do not be like the man who learned to make the sea boil red. Tavern singers sandwiched his story between warnings and repetition, the part praise, the part curse. And in the marketplaces the phrase butter, bread, and green cheese kept being used as both test and talisman, because symbols survive where complex truths do not. Years later, minstrels would compress the entire catastrophe into lines easy to sing and easy to remember. Children would be told stories that made Grutte Pier into a figure of both dread and protection. Merchants and lords would cite his campaign as a cautionary tale or as precedent, depending on what they needed. The land, untroubled by human memory's selectiveness, kept all of it. The steps of those who marched, the breaks between seasons, the names that had been spoken. If someone asks whether he was a liberator or a butcher, a hero or a villain, the best answer is a refusal to choose. He was both, in varying degrees, at different times. He was grief turned action. He was a father who would not be owned, and a commander who learned a terrible thing, that in taking power to prevent subjugation, one can become the very shape one had vowed to resist. The soil that had been the reason for revolt also became the judge of its excesses. It kept a ledger no human hand could erase. On some evenings, when the wind is right and the river pushes against the dikes, those who live near the old fields say they can still hear a chant from another age. A line of three things that once bound people together and now binds them to memory. Butter, bread, and green cheese, they say, still passes between lips in markets and in hushings of children. In the same breath, people speak of a giant who walked like a storm, who loved the earth and used it as excuse, whose deeds are a caution and a catastrophe. History, like the sea, is indifferent to easy verdicts. It gathers wreckage, and it leaves the survivors to carry the stories stitched with their own truths and their blind spots. Grutte Pier's tale became one of those stories, told and retold, each telling reshaped by the teller's need. In taverns, the telling is shorter, spicier. In the halls of lawyers, it is a line of accounts. In the fields, it is a murmur that may or may not remember the names of particular children. In the end, the land remembered. That is the most persistent line in all the tales. Furrows held memory like a book holds a record. Each season an annotation, each harvest a marginal note. Time continued as it always does in places of tide and soil. Storms came, dikes were repaired, seeds planted, people married and buried. The music of life played on, and the story of the giant who drowned the north in blood became part of the landscape of speech, a warning to those who would let grief make them architects of ruin, a complicated echo for those who wished to find something simple in a complex man. There is one last quiet thing to say about legends and about men who wound up famous for what they wrought. Stories can redeem the memory of pain by turning it into lessons, but stories can also gild and hide. When you stand on a dike and look over the fields, you might hear the song and feel a heat in your chest for the man who fought against being owned. You might also see the patchwork of grief in the stony faces of the old and in the uneven yield of the land. The truth sits somewhere in between. If you want to follow more stories like this, of rebel leaders, of the line between justice and violence, of centuries that keep speaking through soil and song, there are other tales waiting, each with its own ambiguities and its own cadences. Look for the playlists and deep dives that untangle legend from ledger and come back to the marshes and the market stalls where the oldest stories are still being told. For now the bells in small chapels ring for those who died, and the farmers plant for another season. Mothers still test a stranger's voice with the litany of butter, bread and green cheese, because identity is a stubborn thing. The songs will keep his name, sometimes praising, sometimes warning, and the soil will keep the rest. Time will tell which memory a people chooses to live by, but the earth, patient and indiscriminate, will hold the ledger long after tongues grow still.